Video on Japanimation, I used the term archetype, and as I've noted in many comments, I am not a big fan of C.G. Jung. I think he's an imaginative idiot. Okay, so people might wonder, why do I use the word archetype if I don't like C.G. Jung? I use the word archetype to explain what I would call an ingrained biological consciousness. What you have to understand is various civilizations are basically the expressed cultural norms, which are basically the ingrained behavioral traits of every individual in that civilization. For example, there is a Germanic consciousness, there is an Anglo consciousness, there is an American consciousness, or at least there used to be before we got all mixed up. So where does this come from? Well, what one has to understand is there is individual variance from individual to individual and individual consciousness to individual consciousness. However, there are innate biological or behavioral traits, I should say, that translate to normal behavior, which is where we get our expressed agreed upon laws, and why laws and culture varies from biological subgrouping to biological subgrouping. I do not believe, as Carl Jung did, in a collective subconscious or any silly crap like that, but I do believe that there are racial consciousnesses. I also believe that when a race blends with another race and becomes something else, that the consciousness changes. For example, when you have an organic blending of two different, completely different groups, such as the Mediterranean people and the Native American people, into the mestizo people or the other various Native American Mediterranean admixtures, you get a new racial consciousness. But it is still, and this is what I admire so much about the former Spanish American Empire, is it is a contiguous, though slightly different, cultural consciousness coming from the biological uniqueness of the people that inhabit the former Spanish American Empire. Now, this is my idea with Pan-Americanism and the need for a Pan-American culture, and this is also why a biological Pan-American race must come to exist for a Pan-American civilization to exist, because it must come from a biological root. I would also like to point out one of the unique things that I find interesting is when you recognize biological racial differences. I've always had, and this is funny because I like to say, I am the most non-racist, most racist person I know, in the sense that as a racial realist and a person that recognizes racial differences and how these translate into behavioral differences, I have been able to relate to so many different people honestly and not have to pretend like I'm going to offend them or things of that nature, because I don't pretend like I am them. I don't pretend like I'm black or that I'm Hispanic or that I'm Asian. I can recognize that they're different. I can recognize key similarities. I can enjoy both the differences and the similarities. Not necessarily of black people. I don't really care for black people very much, but of Asian culture and or Asian individuals, Hispanic individuals, Native American individuals, blended individuals. I have had the ability to relate to so many different people, I believe, so readily because I do recognize the differences and that these differences are real, and that there's no sense in, how can I put this, arguing about differences that have a biological root, and it's better to accept people. It's funny because liberalism, which states that race does not exist, also are the ones that state that race is so important and that we need affirmative action because of racial differences that magically don't exist. And another funny thing about liberalism is they want us to celebrate our differences. However, and this is not just liberalism, this is conservatism too, but they want us to embrace our differences, but state that these differences are all social constructs. Our differences are not social constructs, but they should indeed be celebrated.